In the summer of 1518, something extraordinary happened in the city of Strasbourg. People began to dance, not at a festival, not at a wedding, and not because musicians were playing. They simply began dancing, and according to historical accounts, some seemed unable to stop. It began on July 14, 1518, with a woman known to history as Frau Troffea. She stepped into the street and began to dance. There was no music, no celebration, no obvious reason for what she was doing. She simply began moving, twisting, turning, and dancing through the streets of Strasbourg. At first, people watched. Perhaps they thought she was behaving strangely. Perhaps they thought she was performing some bizarre dance. But then they realized something was terribly wrong. She wouldn't stop. According to historical accounts, Frau Troffea continued dancing for hours. Eventually, she collapsed from exhaustion. Her husband reportedly tried to make her stop. He pleaded with her to rest. Others around her also tried to intervene. But when she recovered, she began dancing again. And then she did something that would make her story one of the strangest episodes in European history. She kept dancing, day after day. Her feet became swollen and injured from the constant movement, yet she reportedly continued. Her husband and others could not understand what was happening. They had no medical explanation. They could not reason with her, and they could not seem to make her stop. Then something even more disturbing happened. Other people began dancing too. Within days, dozens of people were reportedly experiencing the same strange compulsion. The strange behavior was spreading through Strasbourg. Men and women who had been perfectly normal only days before were suddenly dancing uncontrollably. Some danced in the streets, some reportedly screamed or convulsed, and some appeared unable to stop even when they were exhausted. The city began to panic. By August, historical accounts suggest that hundreds of people may have been affected. Imagine Strasbourg at that moment. A city in which people were going about their ordinary lives, while groups of citizens were dancing uncontrollably in the streets. There was no obvious infection, no fever, no visible wound, no known poison, and no explanation that made sense to the people witnessing it. The authorities were faced with something they had never seen before, and then they made a decision that sounds almost unbelievable today. They decided that the dancers needed to dance the illness out of their bodies. Physicians of the period reportedly believed the problem was caused by an excess of hot blood. Their reasoning was that if the victims continued dancing, eventually the condition would burn itself out. So instead of stopping the dancers, the authorities encouraged them to keep dancing. Spaces were opened where the afflicted could continue. A stage was reportedly constructed. Professional dancers were brought in, and musicians were hired to keep the rhythm going. Think about that for a moment. A mysterious medical crisis was spreading through the population. People were collapsing from exhaustion, and the authorities responded by creating places where they could dance even more. It sounds like something from a bizarre horror movie, but the authorities apparently believed they were trying to help. The plan did not work. The dancing continued. People became exhausted and injured, and eventually, the authorities changed their strategy. The dancers were taken to religious sites associated with Saint Vitus, a figure whose name had long been associated with strange dancing disorders. They were encouraged to pray for relief. Gradually, the outbreak began to disappear. By September, the dancing had largely stopped. But Strasbourg was not the only place where something like this had happened. Europe had experienced numerous episodes of dancing mania during the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Groups of people reportedly danced, screamed, convulsed, or behaved uncontrollably. Some outbreaks involved relatively small groups. Others reportedly involved hundreds of people. The phenomenon became associated with names such as St. John's Dance and St. Vitus's Dance. And people had their own explanations. Some believed the victims had been cursed. Others thought they were possessed. Some believed they had offended a saint, and others believed supernatural forces were responsible. But what actually caused these bizarre outbreaks? 500 years later, we still don't have a definitive answer. One theory involves ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that can grow on grains such as rye. Certain forms of ergot poisoning can cause hallucinations, spasms, convulsions, and other neurological symptoms. At first, that might sound like the perfect explanation. People were behaving strangely. They were experiencing involuntary movements, and contaminated grain was common in parts of medieval Europe. But there is a problem. Ergot poisoning does not neatly explain everything reported about Strasbourg. It doesn't easily explain why the phenomenon appeared to spread socially. And some researchers argue that the symptoms and duration don't fit what we would expect from ergot poisoning. So another explanation has become increasingly important: mass psychogenic illness. This is a real phenomenon in which people can experience genuine physical symptoms without an identifiable infectious disease or toxic substance. The symptoms aren't imaginary. The people aren't pretending. Their bodies are genuinely responding to psychological and social forces. And Strasbourg in 1518 was an environment where those forces could have been extraordinarily powerful. The city was suffering from severe social and economic problems. Food was expensive, disease was common, poverty was widespread. People were extremely worried. But there was something else. People already believed that uncontrollable dancing could happen. There were centuries of stories about dancing disorders. There were religious explanations. There were legends about saints. There were previous outbreaks. So imagine what might happen when the first person began dancing. In this case, Frau Troffea. People around her already had a cultural framework for understanding it. One woman began dancing. Others watched. Then others began experiencing strange symptoms themselves. And suddenly, the impossible seemed to be happening all around them. And perhaps what makes the story so fascinating is, unlike a legend about ghosts or monsters, the dancing plague of 1518 was recorded by people who were actually there.